But it wasn't anywhere. Was it in a vault? Was it in boxes? Was it in a cellar? No, it didn't exist. It's all ex nihilo. It's out of nothing. Now, when the Lazard said, when the money is worth nothing, then the crisis will be over, it really meant that you'll be back to reality, and you'll have to start reconstructing. If you then start reconstructing on exactly the same model that produced the chaos, then you are in a very serious situation, not just historically, but again psychiatrically. And this is the end of an age, at the end of something. Now, things don't happen quickly, you see. From the time that Caesar tried to clean up the failed republic, he couldn't do it overnight. Even before he was assassinated, he saw that it was going to take time. And that time he was assassinated, so it had to be carried on by his nephew, by Augustus. So he then had to recreate the society, because it's not just, you can't just reform the money. It's too late to reform the money. There's no money to reform. You have to start again. Everything has to start again, but it doesn't happen overnight. However, this is the point at which Islam becomes very significant, especially in Britain. In Britain, you have a country which has a very important and relevant history to the evolution of the state, to the evolution of trade, and, alas, to the evolution of capitalism. Our last realist reporter on the scene was Charles Dickens, who spoke of unspeakable poverty and degradation. Now he's been surpassed by events. What he reported has been surpassed. There are positive things against all the negatives. If you like, we'll first look at the negatives, and then we'll look at the positives. Well, first the ugly close-up of the reality, and that is that a couple of days before I sat with you in this meeting, British soldiers were being assassinated in Northern Ireland. Now, this goes back to the fact that the Northern Ireland police asked the security people for backup and they did not get it. And you have to say, why were these men killed? And the answer is not to do with the famous Irish question, which is still unresolved. It has to do with the fact that the Blair government set up the foundations of a police state in Britain while abandoning the great historical tradition that goes back to the Plantagenets of civic freedom and civic liberty. Now, in doing it, they first impoverished the police force. They took its money away, and you today have a superb police force, underpaid, under-equipped, and with a superb personnel, the leader of which has declared, I have no confidence in the Home Secretary, as she is incompetent. She is incompetent and incapable of performing her duty. Now, that's a very serious statement, has to be taken very seriously, because the person responsible is the head of the Police Federation. But I'm saying he set up a police state, but the police state he set up was based on an American model, because Blair had taken all his orders from there. And what he did is he poured money into the security services. Again, Britain had a tremendous record of with its security services, with the exception of the unfortunate defections to communism in the mid-20th century. But a whole new breed of people were brought into the security service, and vast resources were poured into it. And in order to do this, it was part of the creation of this legend, this cinematic legend of Islamic terrorism. The destruction of two skyscrapers, however unfortunate, is still not comparable to the firebombing of the city of Dresden and the firebombing of Hamburg. So it did not ever merit the response that came from it. But we now know from President Chirac the response was not about that issue. It was the trigger mechanism to allow the fantasy project of the war against Gog and Magog. Very recently, a group of very mistaken Muslims were taking aid to the Gaza Strip. Mistaken because, while humanly speaking, of course, it is a horrific tragedy, it is not a Muslim affair, because the Gaza Strip is Shia. And therefore, even inside the Islamic discourse, you don't find Gaza. It is now part of the Shia resistance to Islam. However, these very well-meaning men were in convoy across Britain, and they were stopped halfway on the highway by the secret police, and two, I think it was, were retained under the Terrorist Act. This was, again, the need has been, and over the last few years, to generate crisis moments to justify the ongoing budgeting of this overextended secret service who are looking for non-existent terrorists. There would have been terrorists, but the thing has spent itself. As I explained at the very beginning of this crisis, terrorism of its nature, its first action is always its highest, and it's always a diminishing after that, because the fulfillment of the terror system cannot take place like guerrilla warfare can on an ongoing, in an ongoing situation. So what we have is a secret service of very dubious personnel, very compromised leadership. You see, if they were independent of the government, they can fulfill a very necessary and vital role. But if they are obeying a directive and a policy of a government, they become the instruments of intimidation and terror. We now know that they were active in the torture of people from in rendition. So they can no longer pretend that this has not happened. Now, I go back to the soldiers who were tragically killed in Northern Ireland. It is because while they're busy looking for non-existent terrorists, the terror on their doorstep is not being confronted. While the police are being asked to harass Muslims in the streets, which they are doing less and less, but when they're asked to do this, they are not stopping the weekly murder of teenagers by West Indian Christian youths. And this is the reality of Britain, is the murder a week. And the political class is so completely paralyzed that they cannot deal with it. See, the first result of financial collapse is civic collapse. So crime has to rise as the financial system declines. So that's the negative of everything. Now, in terms of the political class, which I define categorically, giving back to them the term that President Sarkozy used about the Muslim citizens of France, racaille, which means scum. It goes, as the Americans say, right back at you. It goes back to them. They are the scum. Fortunately, because of the historical tradition and the continued existence, despite enormous attempts to destroy it, of the education system in Britain,